New York City, the ultimate city, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps. Basically the capital of the world, right? It was a childhood dream of mine to visit New York City, and it finally came true in 2019. So my problem is, every time I visit a major city, I have way too high expectations. And I usually get a little bit disappointed or just underwhelmed by what I'm experiencing. That happened with Bangkok, for example. Bangkok was hyped up in my mind as this crazy Thai city where you can go completely nuts. Hangover, anybody? Don't get me wrong, Bangkok is a cool city, but in my mind I hyped it up way too much. So we were in the US for 3 months now on the East Coast visiting Boston and Washington, and we left one highlight for the end. We are going to fly out of New York City. So my question was, could New York City live up to the hype of my childhood dreams? And I thought I really had to manage my expectations this time to not be disappointed by one of my basically bucket list items. So we booked a 5.5 day stay and a flight down from Atlanta up to LaGuardia Airport, which is located in Queens. And if you fly up the East Coast, Queens is kind of on the right side of Manhattan, so I thought getting a plane seat on the left side would probably give me a nice view of Manhattan and other cities on the way. And that idea turned out to be great, as we saw several cities on the way. We saw downtown Atlanta, then we're passing by Washington DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and finally New York. And as you can see here, it's the perfect view of Manhattan flying into Queens. And within seconds I noticed that Manhattan is just bigger than I expected. And usually things are smaller than I expected. This time it was the other way around. And one funny thought that went through my mind flying in there, looking at all the skyscrapers, is in Germany, we don't have a lot of skyscrapers, but we say the only city with skyscrapers is Frankfurt. And yeah, looking at that, comparing it to Frankfurt skyline in my mind, Frankfurt, that's not a skyline. That Manhattan, that's a skyline. The Manhattan skyline is just on another level, and at that point in time, my excitement already increased. It started to dawn in my head that these dimensions that I built up in my mind as a kid and all these expectations were maybe not that far off. So after we landed, we took a cab from LaGuardia Airport to Manhattan, and it drives you through a little part of Queens first. Most part of Queens is kind of flat, but then the skyline of Manhattan soon appears in the background and starts to get bigger and bigger. And then you cross over the East River to, I think, Governor's Island, and over there the Robert Kennedy Bridge, I think. And just passing over this bridge, first of all, these bridges are way bigger than I imagined, and passing into Manhattan for the first time, I just felt like I'm entering this other dimension, this huge city. It looks like a toy city, and I'm just this little car driving into it, and then it's all of a sudden all surround you. It's crazy. So as soon as we arrived in our hotel, we went out to go for a walk, and it just within the first hour, I felt like this is something special. And I kind of have a weird thing with cities. I have this weird fantasy thing in my mind of a mega metropolis, like a post-apocalyptic world where humanity built a city of 100 million citizens, and it's this concrete jungle of never seen size before. I don't know, maybe I watch too much anime, but something about this idea is very appealing to me, and I'm looking for this feeling, and that's, I think, is a thing that just draws me to these big cities. And within the first hour of walking around in Manhattan, I think I never came as close to my fantasy as I did there. So I am not sure if New York City is the only city that conveys this feeling. Disclaimer here, I haven't been to Shanghai, I haven't been to Tokyo. I really want to go to these two. I think those might be the only two that can really compete to New York. I think they have more of an Asian charm, while New York has more of this, typical New York charm that everybody knows from movies and television, I guess. So over the next 5.5 days, we went out and discovered and explored the city, and I have to admit, my expectations were not met, they were exceeded. And this is very rare to me. Normally I'm underwhelmed, as I said, but this city just has it. I don't know exactly what it is, but it is just crazy and I freaking love it. There were some things that were kind of a little bit underwhelming, like for example the Flatiron building, which is pretty famous, but it's just a pretty regular building standing there in the city and there's really nothing you can do in it, I think. But then on the other hand, there was things that were way better than I expected. For example, the Empire State Building. We went up to that viewing platform and that was just my highlight of the trip, and looking from there over all of Manhattan towards the south, you can see the financial district. It's so far away, you see the One World Trade Center in the background. You can look over Brooklyn and Manhattan on the other side. You can see a little bit of the Central Park and all these high-rise residential buildings that are building. I could just spend hours up there and look at all the buildings. I also really enjoyed the Ground Zero Memorial. That was a thing I vividly remember in 2001 as a kid, and I have to say the memorial they built is feeling super special. They have this big holes in the ground with water appearingly running into the abyss, and it gives a certain sound ambience, and you have all the names of the victims engraved around it. It makes you really feel that something substantial and very terrific went down here not even 2 decades ago. Also the Brooklyn Bridge. I thought it's just a bridge connecting Manhattan to Brooklyn, but that thing is humongous. I didn't even know that these bridges are that big. It took us like 20 minutes to go over it. It was November, so I guess it's busier in the summertime. It was pretty chill, it gets windy up there. But it's awesome for a good look at the skyline and all the cars running through. It's just amazing. And there's one thing that I especially like about the city. And it might be a little bit weird too, but wherever you are in Manhattan, if you cross a street and you basically have 4 directions to look at, you can look into any of those directions and it's just a huge canyon of buildings going down in a straight line, and it ends basically in the sky or the abyss. There is no background. As far as you can see, it's just buildings going down, and then there's white. And that just makes it feel like this crazy city in another dimension. You don't see a hill or anything in there. It's just endless. And I could just walk across the streets and just stand there and look into every direction while everybody else is passing me, and I was like, oh, I hope I have a couple seconds more red light for the cars, because that's just special to me, and every intersection has that, so you get constantly reminded that you're in this humongous sized city. It's just never ending. That's what it feels like. Another thing that plays into the size of the city and that made me really consider living there, or I can see myself living there, is there is always more to discover. I don't know how many million, 8 or 10 million people live in the city, but there are endless shops, venues, buildings, cafes, everything to discover on every block, and you just have to move around a bit. There's always more to discover, and they're building everywhere. So once you think you know an area, a couple weeks later there could be new shops popping up. They're popping up everywhere. Buildings are still being built. They're building higher, more crazier, more futuristic. There's always more to discover in Manhattan. And my favorite part of the city was actually Lower Manhattan, which is not quite as futuristic and crazy as the other parts. It's also a little lower, but it had more charm. It felt like you're back in New York City of the 80s or the 90s. And it's one of the cheaper places. There's also Chinatown there, which is good to get a better value for your food and all that stuff. I don't know, that place just had the most charm to me, Lower Manhattan. So after spending 3 months on the US East Coast, while a couple of things weren't as great as you hoped they would be, New York City is the one city that I visited in my life that, instead of underwhelming me, totally exceeded my expectations. From the first glance out of my airplane window of the financial district of Manhattan until 6 days later when we left, I really feel like this city is special, it is one of a kind, and I can't wait to come back.